This is Deep Night Whispers. Tonight we open a file that was never meant to be found. In the late autumn of 1901, a photograph was taken in a quiet corner of London. It captured a family of 5 standing on the back lawn of a townhouse in Chelsea, the kind of portrait common to that age, formality frozen in silver. The Whitmores were respectable people, their lineage traced through merchants, soldiers and clerks. Nothing about them suggested mystery. The father, Edward Whitmore, was a solicitor for the Crown, practical and reserved. His wife, Margaret, was known for her refinement and delicate health. Between them stood their children, 2 boys in wool coats and a young girl clutching a doll so tightly that even the camera seemed to notice. The photograph, developed days later, was as expected. Proper, still, perfectly ordinary. But decades later, when the image resurfaced in an auction house archive, something impossible was discovered. The figure standing just behind the family, tall, indistinct, partially hidden by the glare of sunlight, was not supposed to be there. He'd not been mentioned in the photographer's notes, nor did any member of the Whitmore family recall another person present that day. Yet the stranger's hand was clear, visible, holding an object so out of place it defied explanation. A small rectangular device, metal and glass, emitting a faint reflection. It was not a watch, it was not a case or book. It looked to modern eyes like a smartphone. For years the photograph circulated quietly among collectors of oddities. Some dismissed it as an illusion of light, a chemical smear or a double exposure. But others, historians and image analysts among them, noted something more chilling. The figure's shadow fell forward across the family, perfectly consistent with the light angle of the afternoon. Whoever he was, he had been there. The earliest records of the photograph came from the archives of Horace Blythe, a studio photographer active in London between 1896 and 1904. Blythe's work was meticulous, often inscribed with plate numbers and exposure data. His surviving notebooks list appointments, locations, and clients with clockmaker precision. On October 14, 1901, his log mentions the Whitmores, followed by a peculiar note scrawled in the margin. "One extra in frame, do not retake." No explanation followed, no second exposure was made, and days later Blythe's studio closed permanently. The Whitmore family portrait was collected, framed, and placed in the drawing room. No one questioned it until tragedy struck less than a year later, when Edward Whitmore was found dead at his office desk. Pen still in hand, a legal document unfinished. The coroner called it a heart attack, but the attending constable wrote a different detail in his private notes. The man had fallen forward, both hands covering his face, as though shielding himself from something unseen. Within months, the family sold their house and left London entirely. The photograph vanished with them. The Whitmore photograph remained unseen for almost 70 years. It resurfaced in 1972 in the basement of an antique dealer named Thomas Beck. He'd been clearing out the remnants of an estate in Surrey when he found a cracked frame wrapped in newspaper from 1903. The image inside had faded around the edges, but the figures were still clear. The family, the garden, the pale sky, and behind them, that same faint silhouette. Beck didn't notice the anomaly at first. He was more interested in the quality of the paper and the brass edging of the frame. Only after developing a cleaned print did he pause. The background figure looked too modern, his clothing strangely fitted, his posture casual in a way no Edwardian ever stood. Most disturbing was the small object he held, reflecting light from a source that seemed to exist outside the picture. Beck sold antiques, not mysteries. Yet something in that image unsettled him enough to write to a photography historian at King's College, Dr. Helen Marwood, enclosing a reproduction and his notes. Her reply arrived within a week. She wanted to see the original. Dr. Marwood examined it under magnification, expecting to confirm a trick of exposure. Instead, she found uniform chemical integrity. No cuts, no retouching, no overlay. The emulsion's age, the plate texture, the silver distribution were all consistent with 1901. What was inconsistent was the light geometry. The gleam on the stranger's object came from an angle the sun could not have reached that afternoon. She filed a brief report, dry and academic, but at the end added one handwritten line. Subject 6 appears aware of camera. 2 weeks later, Beck called to tell her he was hearing voices on his answering machine. Short bursts of static that sounded like breathing. When Marwood visited, she found the photograph propped on his desk, the glass cracked down the centre. He swore he hadn't touched it. She took the picture home, sealed it between panes of archival glass, and placed it in her study. That night she woke to the sound of paper sliding across wood. When she turned on the lamp, the photograph had shifted half an inch. She told no one. The next day, she began testing the image under infrared light. Hidden beneath the surface silver, she found another layer, faint impressions of writing, invisible to the naked eye. The words were not English. They resembled coordinates, numbers interspersed with strange symbols. She traced them carefully, then stopped when she recognized a date embedded in the sequence. October 14th, 1901, the day the picture had been taken. She catalogued the finding, stored the photograph in a sealed envelope, and sent it to a conservator in Oxford for verification. But it never arrived. The courier's parcel was found torn open along a rural road, the envelope empty, the paperwork scattered across the ditch. No theft was recorded, and no suspect identified. Dr. Marwood resigned from her post a month later. Her colleagues recalled her growing withdrawn, distracted, convinced that the same man from the photograph had been captured again in 2 unrelated images she was reviewing, one from 1889, another from 1927. The man's face blurred in both, but the posture was identical. When she died in 1993, her estate inventory listed the Whitmore file as missing. For years afterward, rumours swirled among collectors of anomalous images. They called it the moving photograph, a picture that reappeared wherever it wished to be seen, its subject unchanged, its era irrelevant. By 2009, a digital scan of what claimed to be the Whitmore photograph appeared online. Experts dismissed it as fabrication until the metadata was traced to a defunct London law firm once owned by the Whitmore family. And within the scan, magnified 1,000 times, analysts found a reflection on the object in the stranger's hand. It showed a fragment of another image, an open doorway, a figure standing beyond it, holding a camera identical to the one that took the original picture. The mirror had folded in on itself. In 2011, a restoration lab in Bristol received a shipment of archival materials from a private collector. Among them was a sealed tin case marked only with the initials EW. The label beneath the rust was barely legible, but the customs manifest listed it as Family Negatives 1900-1903. The archivists catalogued the plates mechanically, one by one, until they reached the 5th glass negative. It was wrapped in faded tissue, unusually heavy, and marked with a small wax seal, an emblem that looked like 2 mirrored letters intertwined. When they held it to the light, the faint image revealed itself, the Whitmore family portrait. The technicians didn't yet know what they were looking at, but when they digitized the negative, the monitor flickered and froze. The data corrupted, reformatted itself, and for a fraction of a second displayed a live timestamp, October 14th, 1901. Then the screen went black. When the image finally appeared, it was clearer than any reproduction ever known. The stranger behind the family was visible in full, his face indistinct but symmetrical, his expression unreadable. The object in his hand reflected the photographer's camera, yet the reflection contained details that did not exist in 1901. Modern glass windows, electrical light, and a blurred shape resembling a computer screen. The restoration supervisor, a man named Paul Everett, assumed it was a glitch in the scanner. He restarted the process, but the reflection changed. It now showed the room they were standing in, the equipment, the table, even Everett himself leaning over the plate. Only he was turned slightly toward the camera, though he had not moved. They repeated the scan with another machine. The same anomaly appeared. Everett sealed the plate immediately and placed it in storage. That night, the lab's security system recorded motion near the archive room at 2:13 a.m. A brief flicker of light and a human silhouette, though the building was locked. The next morning, the Whitmore plate was gone. It was found 2 days later, rewrapped and set on the doorstep of the curator's house. No one claimed responsibility. In the following months, the photograph drew the attention of the London Temporal Research Society, a small independent group that studied chronological distortions in early photography. phenomena once dismissed as myth. They compared the Whitmore image to other historical photographs rumoured to contain displaced elements, anachronistic clothing, unrecorded faces, modern devices in ancient contexts. Every analysis pointed to the same conclusion. The negative showed no evidence of tampering. The chemical aging, the dust strata, and the light refraction were all consistent with 1901. Yet the reflected environment was decades ahead of its time. When they enhanced the area around the stranger's eyes, they found two faint shapes within the pupils, identical to the mirrored emblem on the wax seal. One of the researchers, Dr. Adrian Neal, became convinced that the image was a self-replicating temporal loop, a photograph that not only captured a moment but created it. The stranger wasn't intruding from the future, he was being recorded from it. Each time the photograph was developed, it fed new information into its own reflection, altering its content ever so slightly, keeping the loop alive. As Neil described it in his notes, "The act of observing this image is what completes it. Whoever looks into it becomes part of its next reflection." By 2014, Neil's research had gone silent. His final email to a colleague contained a single attachment, a cropped segment of the Whitmore photograph showing only the reflection in the glass. When the image was opened, it contained metadata identical to the present year, down to the second. A week later, Neil disappeared. When investigators entered his office, they found only his coat on the chair and a camera on the desk, pointed toward the far wall. The camera was still recording. On its display, faintly visible, was the same image he'd been studying, the Whitmore family, standing in the garden, their eyes slightly turned toward the viewer. The Whitmore photograph now resides, or so it's claimed, in a private collection somewhere outside London. No museum has publicly confirmed its possession. No archive admits to storing it. Yet every few years a new copy appears online. Slightly altered, subtly rearranged, always the same family, always the same man in the background. I first saw it 3 years ago. It came attached to an anonymous email with no subject line, no text, just the image file and a string of numbers that turned out to be coordinates. They led nowhere, a field in Kent, empty, but I opened the image anyway. The file name was EW1901.reflection. The resolution was impossibly high. At first glance, it was identical to the one published decades before. Edward and Margaret Whitmore, their children poised before the lens, the pale London garden stretching behind them. The stranger stood exactly as before, frozen mid-step, gaze caught between the photographer and something unseen. The object in his hand glowed faintly, as though it were catching light from a place that wasn't there. When I zoomed in, the pixels didn't break. Instead, they deepened, layers of light folding inward until I could see details no camera from 1901 should have captured. The stitching on Edward's cuff, the reflection of clouds in the doll's glass eyes, the faint outline of movement, like breath in the cold. And then, something else. Behind the stranger, faintly visible in the window of the Whitmore house, stood another figure. The outline was soft, almost erased by glare, but the shape was human. The figure was holding something small and rectangular pointed outward, like a modern camera recording the scene. When I mirrored the image, the figure in the window faced me directly, and for a brief second the pixels shifted. I saw my own reflection in the glass. It didn't frighten me at first. After all, digital artifacts can mimic movement, but when I minimized the file, I noticed my camera light, off only seconds before, had turned on by itself. The recording indicator glowed red. The timestamp on the recording, October 14th. That night, I deleted the image from my computer, emptied the drive, and disconnected from the network. But the next morning, when I powered the system back on, the desktop background had changed. The photograph was there again, sharper, clearer, as if restored. And now, the family's eyes had shifted. They were no longer looking at the camera. They were looking directly at me. For 3 nights, I left the monitor on. Each morning, something inside the photograph changed. A branch bending, a curtain drawn, a light glowing faintly behind a window. By the 4th morning, a new reflection appeared in the stranger's glass object. It wasn't the old London garden anymore. It was my own room, captured in perfect detail. That was when I turned off every light in the house. The photograph still sits on my hard drive, no matter how many times I try to erase it. Sometimes I hear the quiet click of a shutter in the dark, followed by a brief pulse of light, like an old flashbulb echoing through time. I've stopped checking the images, but occasionally I catch my reflection in the mirror, and for a heartbeat, it doesn't move with me. Maybe the Whitmore photograph isn't cursed. Maybe it's just waiting, completing itself layer by layer through everyone who looks long enough to be seen. This is Deep Night Whispers. The night remembers every image we try to forget. And in the reflection they are still watching,